I first met the chill of dawn in the cellar beneath my apartment, an ironic birthplace for a dream once hailed as unreal. My name is Marisol Carter, and by the time most of the city was stirring at 6 a.m., I had already spent 2 hours coaxing sputtering neon tubes to life, loading microchips under my loop, and charging electrolytic cells that would power my entire workshop by noon. Most people think hardware hacking looks like a mad scientist flick, a tangle of wires and sparks. But for me, it was precision, patience, and relentless curiosity. It was listening to the faint hum of a voltage regulator tell you it's ready for a stronger challenge. It was the moment a sensor you'd coded from scratch flickered to life on a screen. That moment when code becomes physics. It was home. I worked for Orion Innovations, a boutique firm specializing in cutting-edge environmental sensors. Tiny machines that could detect trace methane leaks beneath farmland, monitor water purity in remote wells, or alert first responders to chemical dangers before they even entered a building. My title was Principal Hardware Architect, but I wore many hats: materials scientist, electronics designer, field technician, proofreader of my own late-night code. I thrived in that chaos, weaving the digital and the physical into devices that could save lives. But for all the accolades from clients and the midnight to sunrise sprints with my team, none of it mattered to my brother Preston. To him, I was some eccentric tinkerer, fiddling with wires and microchips in my pajamas. When I told him I'd spent the last quarter designing a sensor small enough to perch on a hummingbird's back, he'd scoffed and clipped my wings with a phrase that landed heavier than any brick. "That's not a real job, Marisol." I replayed those words as I wiped flux residue from my hands. They burned under my skin, igniting a fierce determination that rippled through every experiment I ran. Preston, my older brother by 3 years, had soared through the corporate labyrinth. Fresh out of college, he'd charmed his way into Barrington and Company, a global consultancy with an office in downtown Chicago. He climbed fast. His LinkedIn bristled with endorsements: strategic thinker, charismatic leader, visionary problem solver. He hosted fancy client dinners and closed multi-million-dollar deals. To the outside world, he was the golden child. But it wasn't enough that he out-earned me, or flaunted his promotions at every family gathering. It was the look in his eyes when he described my work, like I was an oddity, an imposter in my own lab. His words resonated at Thanksgiving, at our parents' anniversary party, even on my 29th birthday. "When are you going to get a real job?" The right job, I wanted to tell him, was one that mattered. A real job solved real problems. But the words never escaped my lips. Instead, I channeled that frustration into the pulsing soldering iron in my hand. The turning point came one Tuesday morning, when the sky was slate gray and the air smelled of rain. Preston called me, his voice clipped. "Marisol," he said without greeting, "I need a favor." I paused, soldering iron poised above a delicate PCB. "What's up?" "My boss is looking for a hardware consultant for a high-profile project, a government contract, big budget. He asked me if I knew anyone. Thought you might be interested." My heart raced. My chance to prove my work was real, but Preston's tone was so condescending that truth tasted bitter. "Are you recommending me, or just mentioning that I exist?" He sighed, the sound like rolling thunder across a calm lake. "I'm mentioning you. You'll need to impress him." That afternoon, I found myself standing in the lobby of Barrington and Company, glass towers rising like monoliths above Michigan Avenue. My workshop was on the 8th floor of a tenement-style building on Halsted. This was the 42nd floor of a corporate colossus. I smoothed my lab coat into a tailored blazer, swapped my grease-stained jeans for charcoal trousers, and fastened my best pair of steel-toed boots replaced with polished loafers. I looked the part of a consultant, at least on the outside. They ushered me into a conference room, where Preston's boss, Leonard Barrington himself, sat behind a mahogany table, fingers steepled, gaze sharp as a laser. He was precisely the type of man who wore consulting like armor: tailored suit, $100 tie, cufflinks that glanced gold in the fluorescent lights. "Miss Carter," he began, voice smooth as aged whiskey, "I've heard you're good at building things others think impossible. I'm working on a project that needs someone like you." I kept my reply calm, though my pulse thundered. I specialize in environmental sensing. What exactly are you developing? His smile had no warmth. Classified. I can't disclose details until you're on board. I'll need a technical proposal by end of week. You'll need to sign an NDA. NDA. Code for endless loops of legalese. But I saw the opening. An invitation to step onto his boss's inner circle. To prove that my job was too real to dismiss. I left that room with a single mission. Draft a proposal so compelling that Leonard Barrington couldn't afford to ignore me. On the bus ride home, I cracked open my laptop and began outlining my approach. Modular sensor arrays, low-power wireless gateways, machine learning-driven calibration routines. I sketched diagrams on napkins, scribbled circuit ideas on the backs of envelopes. Every breath I took filled me with purpose. That night, I returned to my lab at 8 p.m. The echo of the city's subway trains mingled with the hum of my test rigs. Under the light of a single desk lamp, I wrote and rewrote my proposal until the words sparkled with clarity. I wrote about collaboration with Cyrus Industries to refine gas detection algorithms. I proposed partnerships with the University of Illinois for materials testing. I outlined a field trial in rural Nebraska for sensor validation. I marshaled every credential and case study I could muster. By 3 a.m., I clicked send on the email to Leonard Barrington. I leaned back, heart pounding in the silent hum of my equipment. Preston had said my job wasn't real, but tonight I'd given him, and his boss, a reason to think otherwise. The next morning, I found out my proposal had been flagged for immediate review. My phone buzzed with an email from Barrington and Company. Ms. Carter, thank you for your submission. We will invite you to an interview next Tuesday. In the meantime, prepare for a deeper technical evaluation. I stared at that message as the Chicago sun rose over Lake Michigan, casting a thin ribbon of light across the water. For the first time, I felt the tide turn. The real world had knocked, and I'd answered in a voice loud enough to echo through glass towers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The following week crawled by like a wire under tension, every hour stretching as I prepared for my interview with Barrington and Company. I spent my days juggling Orion's urgent deadlines, and my nights drilling myself on any question that could come my way. It wasn't enough to know my sensors inside and out. I had to anticipate the kinds of traps a corporate titan like Leonard Barrington would set, the kind of obstacles that made you second-guess the validity of your own ideas. Preston, naturally, checked in only once. He called me on Wednesday evening, his voice echoing across the connection while he busied himself pouring scotch. I heard the clink of ice against crystal. "You ready for Tuesday?" he asked. "As ready as I can be." "Just remember," he said, and I could practically see that smirk on his face, "you only get one shot. Leonard doesn't tolerate mediocrity." Mediocrity. That word had always been Preston's favorite weapon, a razor he liked to slip under the skin whenever he could. I didn't dignify it with a response. Instead, I forced my focus back to my workbench, where the prototype of my new multi-gas sensor gleamed beneath the lab light. I had a plan, and it was going to speak for itself. Tuesday came like a storm front rolling in. I ironed my blazer 3 times, even though the collar was already crisp. My boots shined under the gray glow of early morning. I held my shoulders back and repeated one mantra: my work is real, my work is needed, my work is mine. When I stepped into Barrington's main conference room, the temperature dropped by 10 degrees. The entire place smelled like expensive cologne and ambition. A panel of 5 people sat at the far end of the table, each with a crisp folder bearing my name. Leonard Barrington himself watched me with that same predator's grin. Beside him was a woman named Elise Moreau, the company's senior environmental advisor. Her eyes flicked over my slides with clinical interest. I opened with my pitch. My sensor suite will not only detect methane leaks at parts per billion levels, but will also predict failure points in existing infrastructure before they happen. Elise leaned forward. "Prediction requires more than detection. How will you train your models on so few data points?" I met her gaze. I've developed a synthetic data generation module using real environmental noise. I run thousands of permutations before deploying the algorithm in the field. Leonard interrupted. And your failsafe? What happens when your device goes offline in a hostile environment? Each unit operates in a mesh network, I answered. If one node fails, the others self-heal and reroute the signal. Preston watched from the corner. He looked almost impressed, but that expression was fleeting, replaced by his usual smug disinterest. For 90 minutes I fielded every question they threw at me, my answers flowing like current through a well-soldered wire. When they finally dismissed me, Leonard only offered a single nod. You'll hear from us in a few days. I stepped back onto Michigan Avenue, the city's chaos unfolding around me. Taxis honking, the L rattling above, commuters locked in their own orbits. I wanted to scream, to let out the tension that had coiled in my chest all week. But I didn't. I just breathed, knowing I'd done everything I could. 3 days later, my phone buzzed while I was elbow-deep in a design sprint at Orion. I wiped my hands on a rag and answered. Preston's name glowed on the screen. Congratulations, he said, his voice lacking any real warmth. You're in. Leonard wants you to lead the sensor development team for the entire project. My throat tightened. Seriously? Yeah, don't screw it up. Click. Just like that, he was gone. The line dead, and the empty lab around me echoing with the silence he left behind. But I didn't have time to bask in the victory. The contract was massive. Too big to handle from my basement lab. I needed a bigger space, more people, more funding. So I made the call that would change everything. I offered Orion Innovations the chance to merge our work with Barrington's project. It took a single presentation to the board for them to agree. Suddenly, my name was on every progress report, my ideas threaded through an entire team. And Preston? He got a front-row seat to every milestone. Each update forced him to acknowledge what he'd tried so hard to deny. My job was real, and it was growing beyond him. One Thursday evening, weeks into the project, I found myself standing at a rooftop bar downtown for a rare team-building event. Preston was there too, a few feet away, bragging about his latest deal to anyone who'd listen. I overheard his boss, Leonard, mention my name. Marisol's work has saved us millions in field diagnostics already, Leonard said. Smartest hire we've made in years. Preston shifted, his eyes flicking to me. There was a tightness around his mouth I'd never seen before, resentment mixed with something else. Fear. The next day, everything changed. My assistant, Jenna, forwarded me an email chain Preston had accidentally copied me on. It was a pitch to a competing firm, selling my sensor schematics, marketing strategies, the entire framework. He planned to jump ship and offer them everything. My hands shook as I scrolled. He'd mocked me for building something unreal, but the moment he saw its worth, he tried to trade it for a bigger slice of his own pie. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I called Leonard first thing in the morning. I forwarded every email, every text, every shred of proof. He didn't respond right away, but by noon I was summoned to his office. I stepped into that glass fortress for the third time in as many months. Leonard sat at the head of the table, Preston beside him, looking pale and cornered. Preston, Leonard said, his voice dripping with frost, would you like to explain this? Preston's eyes darted to me like I was the one who'd betrayed him. He sputtered excuses, miscommunication, taken out of context. But Leonard wasn't having it. The betrayal cut deeper because Barrington and Company had staked so much on my work. You can't do this, Preston hissed at me when Leonard stepped out to take a call. This is family. You can't ruin me. I met his glare, all the years of his dismissive laughter piling up behind my eyes. You already ruined yourself. When Leonard returned, he spoke to me like Preston wasn't even there. Marisol, how would you like to handle this? The power in that question hit me like a punch. This was my chance to draw the line, to prove once and for all that my work wasn't a toy for Preston to pawn. I want him off the project, I said, but not fired. Preston's face twitched with confusion. Make him your intern, I continued. Let him learn what a real job looks like. Leonard's smile was a glint of steel. Consider it done. Preston started to protest, but Leonard silenced him with a single look. "Get your things," he said. "You'll be working under Marisol from now on." As we left that office, Preston shot me a look that should have turned me to stone. But all I felt was the electric rush of a circuit finally completing. I'd built my job from the ground up. Now I'd build my brother's humility the same way. One wire, one solder, one reality check at a time. And as we stepped into the elevator, the city below us a grid of blinking lights, I realized the real work had just begun. Preston didn't say a word as we rode the elevator down 42 floors. I watched his reflection in the mirrored walls, jaw tight, hands knotted at his sides like he was bracing for impact. The doors opened onto the marble lobby, swallowing us into the mid-morning buzz of suits and polished shoes. For the first time in my life, I felt taller than my brother. He trailed a step behind as we crossed to the street. The cold Chicago air slapped my cheeks awake. I half expected him to break the silence with some sarcastic jab, but he didn't. He just glared at the sidewalk as if it might open up and swallow him whole. "So," I said finally, "when can you start?" His eyes shot up, sharp as broken glass. "You think this is funny?" "No," I said, "but it is necessary." We stopped at the curb. I pulled out my phone, tapped open my calendar, and rattled off dates. "Orientation at Orion begins Monday morning. Don't be late. Bring your laptop, no ties, just wear what you don't mind getting solder paste on." Preston scoffed. "I'm not wearing a lab coat." "Good," I said. "You won't be issued one until you've earned it." A cab pulled up and I opened the door for him. For a second, I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Not anger this time, but something that almost looked like regret. He ducked into the cab without another word. I watched the car disappear into the city's veins, the ghost of his pride trailing behind it. Back at Orion, the lab hummed like a living thing. Jenna looked up from her terminal when I walked in, her eyes flicking to my empty hands. "So?" she asked. "He starts Monday," I said, shrugging out of my coat. "As an intern." Her grin was wide enough to light the whole floor. God, I wish I could have seen his face. "You might," I said, deadpan. "You're training him." She threw her head back and laughed so hard she nearly knocked over her coffee. I buried myself in work that weekend. There was no room for hesitation now. The Barrington contract was only getting bigger, expanding into pilot programs for half a dozen municipalities. If these sensors worked as designed, they'd revolutionize how cities detected leaks, pollution spikes, even illegal dumping. The stakes were bigger than my petty feud with Preston. I reminded myself of that every time my old anger threatened to rise again. Monday arrived like a test I'd already passed. Preston showed up 5 minutes early, standing stiff as a statue in our narrow lobby. He wore an overpriced blazer, loafers that probably cost more than the total worth of my first car, and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "You'll want to lose the jacket," I told him. "Also the shoes. You'll ruin them." He opened his mouth to argue, then thought better of it. I led him down the main hallway. The air smelled like solder flux and burnt coffee. A smell I'd come to love. Our lab was organized chaos. Circuit boards, stacked beside oscilloscopes, bins of resistors and diodes. Prototype drones perched on high shelves like mechanical birds. Preston looked like he was walking through a foreign country. I introduced him to Jenna first. "You already know Jenna. She'll get you logged in. You're shadowing her until you understand the basics." Preston looked at her, then at me. "I have an MBA, Marisol." "Great," I said. "You'll need it when you're scheduling part shipments and managing our vendor invoices." He bristled, but Jenna just winked at him. "Coffee's free," she said. "But if you break the espresso machine, you buy the next one." He looked like he might combust, but he nodded and followed her to the workbench. I watched them for a few minutes before ducking into my office. I told myself I wouldn't hover. This wasn't about revenge. It was about trust, and about making sure he learned what real meant in a job that didn't come with marble floors and gold cufflinks. Hours turned into days. Preston fumbled with the simplest tasks, logging part numbers into our supply chain system, triple-checking resistor values before soldering them onto a test board. The first time he tried to wire up a power regulator, he nearly shorted the whole thing. Jenna shot me a text later. Your brother owes me a latte." I couldn't help but grin. He was learning. Slowly, grudgingly, but he was learning. Friday afternoon, I found him alone in the back lab, hunched over an open sensor module. He didn't hear me approach. "Need a hand?" I asked. He startled, almost dropping the probe in his hand. "No," he muttered. "I've got it." I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You know, the first time I tried that calibration, I fried 2 motherboards." He looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "Really?" "Really," I said. "It's a pain until you understand how the ground planes interact." He frowned, then went back to work. For a moment, I saw him as just a man out of his depth, stripped of his smugness, reduced to raw frustration and determination. It was almost enough to make me pity him. Almost. The weeks that followed were a blur of progress and stumbles. Preston made mistakes, but he made fewer of them each time. He started asking Jenna smart questions. Once, I caught him reading a soldering guide on his phone during lunch. He grumbled less. He still hated the coffee. It was around week 6 when the real test came. Barrington and Company decided to host a live demo for our biggest city client yet, New York. They wanted to see our sensors in action before greenlighting a full deployment. The stakes were astronomical, a multi-million-dollar expansion, a chance to cement Orion as the leader in environmental monitoring. We needed every hand on deck, and that included Preston. The night before the demo, the lab hummed like a hive. Engineers checked modules, polished enclosures, wrote last-minute diagnostic code. Preston hovered near a bench, triple-checking inventory with Jenna. He looked tired but steady. When I caught his eye, he didn't flinch. "Ready?" I asked. He nodded. "Yeah." The next morning, we set up in an abandoned industrial park on the edge of the city, a perfect testbed for methane detection. I ran point with the client reps, explaining our process, our fail-safes, our emergency protocols. Preston was on equipment duty. One of the older sensors sputtered out mid-demo, threatening to tank the whole presentation. I turned to him, panic spiking under my skin. "Backup unit," I snapped. "Now." To his credit, he didn't freeze. He sprinted to the truck, grabbed the spare module, and swapped it with steady hands. 30 seconds later, our mesh network picked up the signal, and the client's monitors flickered green. The crisis passed like a bad dream. Afterward, the client lead shook my hand, all smiles. "Impressive, Ms. Carter. You've got a hell of a team." I glanced at Preston. He met my eyes, just for a moment, and this time there was no smugness, no bitterness, just respect, maybe even pride. We packed up in the soft light of dusk. I found him leaning against the truck, peeling off his gloves. "Good work today," I said. He snorted. "Didn't think you'd say that." "You did what you had to do," I said. "That's what a real job is." He was quiet for a long time. The city skyline glowed behind him, towers of glass catching the last rays of sun. "I didn't get it before," he said, "but I think I do now." I didn't say anything. I just let the moment sit between us, alive and humming with possibility. We rode back to the lab in silence. For the first time in years, it wasn't the silence of resentment. It was the silence of work well done, and of something broken slowly, painstakingly, knitting itself back together. The real work had only just begun. By the time we rolled back to the lab after the demo, the Chicago skyline was little more than a jagged silhouette against a bruise-colored sky. We parked the van behind the building, the faint buzz of sodium streetlights flickering overhead. Preston lingered by the back doors, hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket, watching as I unloaded the last crate of spare sensors. "Leave it," I told him. "Jenna and the night crew will log inventory." He looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. He'd stopped fighting me on the small things lately, a sign, I hoped, that he was beginning to see the rhythm beneath the chaos. Inside the lab, the hum of servers and the faint click of a distant keyboard was our soundtrack. Most of the team had already gone home, but I liked staying late after big milestones. There was something sacred about the hush that settled over soldering stations and tangled cables when no one was there to judge your missteps. Preston trailed me to the kitchenette. I filled the electric kettle, too tired to care that the tea bags were the cheap ones we bulk ordered by the case. You want one? I asked. He hesitated. Sure. I passed him a mug, and for a moment we just stood there, the steam curling between us like an olive branch neither of us quite trusted yet. So, he said finally, voice low, that went better than I expected. It did, I said. Thanks for stepping up. He shrugged, studying the swirl of his tea. Didn't have a choice, did I? No, I said, cracking the faintest smile. But you handled it. He looked up then, eyes catching mine in the harsh fluorescent light. There was something fragile in his expression, an admission of defeat, and a question all at once. For years, Preston had thrived on being the one who knew the game better than anyone else. Now, he was learning a different game, one that didn't care how slick your pitch was if your sensor module fried under field conditions. I still don't understand how you do it, he said. All these machines, the code, the parts, one can't even pronounce. I took a sip of my tea, letting the bitter warmth anchor me. You learn it piece by piece. It's never finished. You don't master it. You live with it. He barked a soft laugh, shaking his head. I thought I was the smart one. You are smart, I said. But this isn't about smart. It's about staying when everyone else gives up. His shoulders sank. I get that now. We didn't say much after that. He took his mug and wandered to the front of the lab, peering through the glass at the empty street beyond. For the first time, he looked less like my brother, the big shot consultant, and more like the kid who used to help me rig up broken radios in Dad's garage. The next few weeks blurred into a cycle of 12-hour days and longer nights. Orion's merger with Barrington's project meant a tidal wave of new hardware orders, stress tests, and government site visits. Preston fell in line, mostly. He stopped complaining about grunt work. He asked smart questions in meetings. When a component shipment went missing in transit, he took charge of tracking it down, calling vendors until midnight. Still, the old Preston flared up sometimes. One afternoon, I caught him whispering with a junior engineer, fishing for shortcuts on a prototype test run. Hey, I snapped, cutting him off. You do it right, or you do it twice. He bristled, cheeks red. I'm trying to save time. And you're wasting more, I shot back. There are no shortcuts here. If you can't handle that, maybe you're not ready for this. We locked eyes for a long moment. Then he dropped his shoulders, nodded, and got back to work. As winter settled over the city, the lab became a fortress against the cold. Radiators hissed under frost-rimmed windows, while our people ran diagnostics and tweaked code. Our reputation grew with every successful field test, every municipal contract that went from handshake to signature. One night I was alone in my office, reviewing a batch of performance logs. My eyes burned from the screen glare. I leaned back, listening to the hum of the building. Somewhere beyond my door, I heard quiet footsteps. A soft knock. Preston pushed the door open, his face half hidden in the shadows. Got a sec? Sure, I said. What's up? He slipped inside, closing the door behind him. In his hand was a folder, our latest QA reports. He dropped into the chair opposite me. I went through the new sensor data, he said. You were right about the signal drift in the cold. I flagged it for the software team. I raised an eyebrow. You did? He nodded. And I found a vendor who can source better thermal shielding. Costs more up front, but it'll pay off long term. A warmth spread in my chest that had nothing to do with the radiator. Good call. He hesitated, fidgeting with the folder's corner. I know I was an ass. Before. I let him squirm for a moment. Yeah, you were. He cracked a tiny smile. I'm trying. I want you to know that. I do, I said softly. Keep showing me. He exhaled like he'd been holding that breath for years. When he left my office, he closed the door gently behind him, something he never used to do. Winter gave way to spring, and the city thawed with it. Orion moved into a bigger facility, thanks to the influx of new contracts. We doubled our team, onboarded new engineers, and added a whole wing dedicated to rapid prototyping. At our first all-hands in the new space, I stood in front of the glass wall that overlooked the river. Preston was there, tucked in among the interns. Jenna shot him a grin when I mentioned our record delivery numbers. He didn't flinch when I singled him out for leading the QA audit that caught a major defect before shipment. He'd earned that mention, and he knew it. Later that week, Leonard Barrington stopped by the new lab. He walked through the rows of test benches and sensor arrays, hands clasped behind his back. He paused beside Preston, who was elbow-deep in a tangle of fiber cables. "Mr. Carter," Leonard said, voice smooth as ever, "I hear you're adapting well." Preston looked up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yes, sir." Leonard's eyes flicked to me, his thin smile ghosting across his face. "Your sister's done good work here." Preston didn't argue, didn't roll his eyes, didn't crack a joke, he just nodded. When Leonard left, Preston found me near the break room. "He likes you," he said. "He likes results," I corrected. Preston chuckled. "Yeah, guess he does." I wondered then what my parents would say if they could see us now, the golden child in coveralls, my hands still streaked with solder burns, the two of us, finally standing side by side instead of across an invisible battlefield. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was real, and real was enough. One evening, after a long day spent debugging firmware with our new recruits, I found Preston sitting alone on the backloading dock. He stared out at the river, the city lights shimmering on the water like fireflies caught in the current. "You good?" I asked, easing down beside him. He shrugged. "Better than I deserve." I nudged him with my elbow. "You're earning it." He looked at me then, eyes clearer than they'd been in years. "You ever think we'd end up here?" "No," I said honestly. "Not in a million years." He laughed. "Me neither." We sat there in the hum of the city, the two of us breathing in the quiet. Somewhere deep inside, I knew this wasn't the end of our story. It was just another milestone, another prototype to refine, another late-night stitching broken circuits into something that worked. In this place we'd built, this lab, this family, this job that no one could call unreal, I finally understood what I'd spent all these years fighting for. And so did he. The river behind the lab carried the city's secrets down to the lake, just as it always had. I'd sat on that loading dock 100 times before, but that night, next to Preston, it felt different. The weight between us wasn't hostility anymore. It was something heavier and better, accountability. The spring thaw brought more than sunlight and pigeons nesting in the rafters. It brought expansion. Word of our sensors spread across city councils and state agencies like brush fire. What started as a single contract with Barrington and Company was now blossoming into pilot programs in New York, London, and a pair of industrial cities in Germany. The demands were bigger than my little basement lab could handle, even with our new wing. So I did what I'd sworn I'd never do. I took on investors. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. The work was outgrowing me. If I didn't let it breathe, it would suffocate under the weight of my own control. Preston was there for every pitch meeting. He sat in the back of those glass conference rooms, scribbling frantic notes while I explained our roadmap to men in suits who thought a microchip was a snack for a robot. His presence grounded me, reminded me where I'd started, soldering boards at the kitchen table while he mocked me from the couch. Now he leaned forward during Creamed A, correcting misconceptions about our fail-safes, our sourcing, our disaster recovery plans. Watching him do it was like watching an old dog learn not just new tricks, but a whole new language. After one particularly grueling meeting with a venture group from Boston, we ducked into a corner cafe to decompress. Preston stirred his coffee, staring at the foam like it held answers. "You realize," he said, "if this goes through, you'll have more oversight than you ever wanted." I smirked. "Yeah, but we'll also have the capital to build something nobody can ignore." He lifted his eyes, studying me like he was seeing me for the first time all over again. "You always saw this, didn't you? Even when you were in the basement, surrounded by junk parts." "I didn't see this," I said. "I just knew I wanted to make something that couldn't be erased." He nodded. "Well, you did." I snorted into my coffee. "Didn't do it alone." He grinned, but there was a crack in it. "Still can't believe I'm your intern." "You're more than that now," I said. "You know that, right?" He shrugged, but the look on his face said he did. It was 2 weeks later, in the middle of an investor Q&A session, that the next curveball hit. I had just finished answering a question about our sensor array's resilience when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it. It buzzed again. 3 times, then 4. When the meeting ended, I checked the screen. 6 missed calls from Jenna. My stomach flipped. I called her back immediately. She didn't bother with a greeting. "Marisol, we've got a problem." What happened? One of our prototype units in Hamburg went offline during a municipal gas leak. The local fire department had to evacuate a block blind because the warning never came through. My pulse hammered. Is anyone hurt? No injuries, but the city's livid. They want answers. I closed my eyes, steadying my breathing. This was the nightmare scenario, the tech failing when people needed it most. "Where's Preston?" I asked. "In the back lab," she said. "He's already pulling the logs." By the time I made it to the lab, Preston had 3 laptops open, data streaming across each screen in a mess of diagnostic readouts and error codes. He didn't even look up when I stepped in. "It's the relay node," he said, voice hoarse from hours of talking to vendors and our local team. "It overheated. The failover didn't kick in because the firmware was outdated." "I thought we patched those units," I said. He scrubbed a hand through his hair, wild and greasy from lack of sleep. "We did, except this one. The field team swapped it last minute and didn't push the update." I pinched the bridge of my nose. "So, human error." "Yeah," he said quietly, "but it's on us to fix it." We spent the next 48 hours in crisis mode. No sleep, no breaks. Just endless calls with city engineers, remote diagnostics, firmware patch rollouts. I watched Preston lead a training session with our field crew at 4 in the morning, hammering home how to verify updates in the future. When we finally closed the last trouble ticket, the Hamburg site back online, I collapsed onto the old couch in the break room. Preston dropped beside me, his eyes bloodshot. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have caught it sooner." "You caught it when it mattered," I said. "That's what counts." We sat there in the hush of the lab's after hours, the glow of the vending machine painting us in sickly blue light. For the first time, I felt like we were on the same side, not just as siblings, but as partners. A few days later, we gathered the entire team in the new conference room for a debrief. I stood at the front, Preston beside me. I didn't sugarcoat it. "We screwed up," I said, "but we didn't bury our heads in the sand. We owned it, we fixed it, and we learned from it. That's what keeps this job real." Preston stepped forward. "I know some of you think I'm just here because of my name. But I'm here because I believe in what we're building. I see now what it takes. And I'm not going anywhere." Jenna raised her coffee cup like a salute. The room echoed with murmurs of agreement. That was the moment I knew. Preston was no longer just my intern. He was my ally. Spring blurred into summer. The Barrington contracts multiplied. We broke ground on a new fabrication lab that would triple our output. Investors circled like sharks, but I kept a tight leash on the vision. This work would never be hollowed out by shareholders chasing quarterly spikes. Not if I had any say in it. And through it all, Preston kept showing up, at my side for strategy meetings, in the trenches with the junior techs, even spending Saturday mornings soldering test rigs while the city woke up around us. One humid Friday, as we prepped for the rollout of our first full-scale deployment in New York, he caught me staring at a stack of invoices, the weight of it all pressing down on my shoulders. "What?" he asked. I shook my head. "Nothing. Just wondering when it'll stop feeling like we're on the edge of a cliff." He leaned against my desk, arms crossed. "Never does. That's what makes it real, right?" I laughed, a tired, grateful sound. "Yeah, I guess it is." And it hit me. In that ordinary moment, we'd made it real. We'd made it ours. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. The weeks after the Hamburg incident blurred into one long stretch of adrenaline, backlogged orders, and a swirl of site visits that made the lab feel less like a second home and more like Grand Central Station. Every day was a new escalation. City officials wanting walkthroughs, investors demanding projections, engineers from London dialing in at 3 a.m. with questions only I could answer. Through it all, Preston stayed by my side. The Hamburg slip-up had cracked him open in a way no speech ever could. He learned the lesson every engineer learns eventually. One bad relay, one unchecked line of code, and real lives were at stake. It wasn't the pitch decks and polished spreadsheets he'd mastered in the corporate world. It was wires and firmware, and humans messing up in the middle of the night. And there were no shortcuts. One sweltering afternoon, a few days after we finalized the New York contract, we stood side by side in front of a massive whiteboard covered in schematics and supplier lists. The window AC wheezed like a dying cat, and every surface in the lab seemed to radiate heat. "Jenna's been fighting the supplier on the gas membrane modules," Preston said, tapping a line item with a marker. "They keep pushing the shipment back by 2 weeks. That's going to kill our deployment timeline." I wiped sweat from my forehead. "Did you try the secondary supplier?" "Yeah, but their QA is trash. Half the batch failed the pressure tests last time." I blew out a breath. "Okay, we buy the delay now and make up the time in assembly. I'll move half the line to double shifts if we have to." Preston didn't argue. That was new. 6 months ago, he would have barked about cost overruns or pointed to some glossy consulting slide deck about efficiencies. Now he just nodded and started mapping out a new work schedule. The real change, though, came at the next investor update. We held it in our cramped conference room, glass walls smudged with fingerprints and marker ghosts of old brainstorms. Some bigwig from the VC firm asked about the Hamburg leak. "What are you doing to prevent something like that in the future?" the man asked, his tone all silk and knives. Preston answered before I could open my mouth. "We've restructured the entire field deployment protocol. New validation checks, mandatory remote diagnostics before any install. We've also integrated a live update confirmation step. No field unit goes active without a double handshake between firmware and cloud." The bigwig frowned. "So you're adding more time on site? Doesn't that reduce margins?" Preston leaned forward, elbows on the table. "No, it reduces risk. And if we lose the trust of the cities we serve, there's no margin to protect." The room fell quiet. I watched a few heads nod. The conversation shifted. For the first time, I saw it land on him that he wasn't just my backup singer anymore. He was the co-architect of this thing. Later that night, we walked the short distance back to my apartment. The city hummed around us. Sirens, distant music, the low drone of traffic rolling toward the lake. "You didn't have to take that bullet," I said. He glanced at me, an amused look on his face. "What? The question? Please, you'd have done it for me." I laughed. 5 months ago, you'd have thrown me under the bus to protect your bonus." His mouth twitched. 5 months ago, I didn't know the bus would be hauling a shipment of defective sensors with it. We both cracked up at that, right there on the sidewalk under the glow of the street lamp. For the first time, our laughter didn't feel forced or defensive. It felt earned. I unlocked my building's door, and as we stepped inside, Preston cleared his throat. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking. Maybe it's time I dropped the intern label." I raised an eyebrow. "You think you're ready for that?" He looked me dead in the eye. "I do, but you're the boss." I didn't answer right away. The old me would have bristled at the idea, afraid he'd slip back into old patterns the moment I let him off the leash. But the truth was, he'd earned it. He'd pulled all-nighters, owned up to mistakes, and even bailed us out when the Hamburg site nearly wrecked our credibility. "Come to the team review tomorrow," I said finally. "Pitch me your plan for your new role. Convince me." He nodded. "Deal." The next morning, he did exactly that. He walked into the team huddle with a stack of printed slides. No glossy corporate fluff this time, just workflows, cost projections, and a draft outline for how he'd build a dedicated field ops division inside Orion. I grilled him on every bullet point. So did Jenna. So did half the engineers who'd come to trust him, grudgingly, over late-night troubleshooting sessions. When he finished, he didn't puff up or beg for applause. He just looked at me and waited. I leaned back in my chair. "All right, you're our new director of field ops. Effective immediately." Jenna whooped. Someone started a slow clap. Preston just let out a long breath, like he'd been underwater for too long and had finally broken the surface. He didn't gloat, didn't throw my old words back at me. He just nodded once, sharp and grateful. That night, we dragged folding chairs onto the roof of the new lab building, 3 stories above the street, the skyline glittering like spilled jewelry. I cracked open 2 cans of cheap beer from the break room fridge. He raised his can in a toast. "To real jobs," he said. I tapped mine against his. "To earning them." We sat there until the city lights blurred into dawn. A week later, Preston put his new title to the test. The New York deployment kicked off in a maze of narrow streets and aging gas mains. Everything that could go wrong did. Delivery trucks stuck in gridlock. An unexpected storm knocking out cell coverage. A rogue subcontractor trying to cut corners. But Preston didn't flinch. He barked orders, kept our crew calm, and flagged a critical design flaw that could have tanked the entire mesh network. He called me at 2 a.m. to talk me through his fix. "Get some sleep, Carter," he said when we wrapped. "We've got this." When I hung up, I realized I believed him. And so did the client. The city signed off on our final install without a hitch. The pilot data came in squeaky clean. 0 signal drop, 0 downtime. For the first time, the sensors I'd once soldered together in my basement lab were saving lives at scale. At the next company meeting, I stood in front of our entire crew, more than 40 people now, crammed shoulder to shoulder in our too small kitchen, and raised a toast of burnt coffee. 6 months ago, none of this was real, I said. It was just a few ideas and a handful of prototypes. Now look at us. Look at what you built, what Tyra built. Preston caught my eye, his coffee lifted in salute. I saw the pride there, and for once it wasn't about money or bragging rights. It was about being part of something no one could dismiss. As I looked around that room, I knew we weren't done, not by a long shot. There were more cities to protect, more designs to refine, more nights to spend hunched over boards that wouldn't behave. But for the first time, I knew I wouldn't be alone. We'd built this thing together, every solder point, every code commit, every apology and second chance. And we were just getting started. The months after New York's rollout were like stepping onto a conveyor belt that only sped up. 1 city turned into 3, 3 turned into 7, and by the time the leaves started turning gold again, our tiny lab had bloomed into a company that people actually knew by name. Orion Innovations was no longer just a line on a government contract. It was an insurance policy against the next leak, the next toxic spill, the next disaster someone else would have ignored. Preston leaned into his new role like he'd been born for it. He caught every glitch that might have slipped through the cracks. He handled field teams with a surgeon's calm, navigating union reps, local politics, even neighborhood committees that wanted to fight our installs because they didn't trust anything with wires and blinking lights. One morning, I found him hunched over a battered city zoning map, red circles scrawled around every choke point in a fragile waterline. He looked up, dark crescents under his eyes, but a spark of excitement I hadn't seen in years. "Marisol," he said, tapping the map, "if we can run a parallel detection here, we'll catch contamination at the source, not downstream. Imagine the cost savings for the city. The PR alone." I couldn't help it. I laughed. "Listen to you. Next you'll be quoting field calibration numbers to strangers in elevators." He smirked but didn't deny it. There was something so different in him now, that hunger to build, to know his job wasn't just real but vital. Not everyone saw it that way though. With our growth came sharks, and they smelled fresh blood in the water. Leonard Barrington, who'd once been our biggest advocate, started hinting about acquisitions. I knew the game. Big consulting arms snap up boutique labs, strip them for parts, spin out the shiny pieces, and dump the rest in a bin labeled R&D expenses. I didn't want to sell, not yet, maybe not ever. Orion wasn't a prize to auction off. It was a promise I'd made to the people who trusted my sensors to keep them safe. But the pressure built. Every week, there was a new meeting. Leonard's legal team pushing for early buyout clauses, investors sending subtle threats about liquidity events, city partners dropping hints that they'd be more comfortable working with a quote-quote corporation behind our hardware. One night, the pressure boiled over. I was at my desk, surrounded by sketches for our next-gen microsensor, a design so small it could ride a drone the size of a pigeon. Preston stood in my doorway, arms crossed. "We need to talk," he said. I didn't look up. "If this is about Leonard, I'm not budging." "It's not just Leonard," he snapped. "It's the whole board. They're spooked. They think you're stalling because you can't scale this thing." I slammed my pencil down. "I'm scaling it. I'm just not doing it at the expense of everything we built." He came closer, lowering his voice. You're not listening. They're going to force your hand. They'll call the note on the convertible debt if you keep stonewalling. I laughed, sharp and humorless. What do you suggest, genius? We sell? Watch some conglomerate rebrand our sensors and cut corners until someone dies? He fell silent. For a moment, he looked exactly like the kid who'd broken my first prototype out of spite when we were 12. But then he did something I didn't expect. He sat down, resting his elbows on his knees. I don't want to sell either, he said. But you need allies. Not just me. The board doesn't trust you because you still run this place like a garage project. It was a garage project, I shot back. It can't be anymore, he said. If you want to keep control, you have to show them you're not afraid to lead like a CEO. The room fell quiet. My throat tightened. I'd spent years telling myself titles didn't matter, that the work would speak for itself. But the truth was, work doesn't get a vote. People do. And people needed a face they could believe in. So, I said, my voice hoarse, what are you saying? He met my eyes. I'm saying you stop hiding behind your soldering iron. You take that investor call tomorrow, you hold the line. And if they want to push you out, they'll have to go through me. I searched his face for a flicker of the old Preston, the opportunist, the smooth talker, the brother who once sold my parts stash to a pawn shop in college for beer money. But all I saw was a man who'd finally learned what he'd nearly destroyed. The next morning, I did what he said. I stood up in that investor call, half a dozen suits blinking at me through a Brady Bunch grid on Zoom, and told them exactly where I stood. Orion would not be sold. We would scale, yes, but on asterisks our terms. Our contracts would stay direct. Our designs would stay in-house. And if they didn't like it, they were welcome to walk. I half expected Preston to flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his chair beside me, arms crossed, nodding at every line. When the call ended, silence filled the lab. The hum of our servers, the buzz of a soldering gun somewhere down the hall, the muffled city outside. It all felt sharper, more real. Preston turned to me. Well? I shrugged. I guess we find out who's in our corner now. He grinned. Guess we do. In the weeks that followed, some of those investors did walk. They slammed doors and sent bitter emails about lost opportunities and poor judgment. But the ones who stayed, they were the ones who mattered. They wanted our mission, not just our margins. Preston took the hits with me. He fielded the angry calls, the panicked contractors, the worried city officials. He did it without once looking at me like I'd screwed up. He did it like someone who finally understood what it means to bet everything on something you built with your own hands. The day our new microsensor prototype passed its first stress test, he found me in the back lab. I'd fallen asleep on a pile of data sheets, the gentle beep of my test rig my only lullaby. He set a mug of terrible lab coffee beside my elbow and sat on the workbench across from me. You know, he said, when I called your job fake, I didn't mean it the way you think. I raised an eyebrow, fighting a yawn. Oh, really? I thought... He paused, searching for the right words. I thought you were too good for it. That you could do anything, but you were hiding behind all these wires and junk parts. My chest tightened. That's not how it felt. I know, he said softly. I was wrong. You weren't hiding. You were building something none of us had the guts to imagine. I looked at him, this man who had once been my biggest critic, my harshest shadow, now my unexpected shield. We did it, I said. Together. He nodded. Together. And in that hum of circuits and cooling fans, I knew we were nowhere near finished. The job was real, the fight was real, and for once, so was he. Besada. I could feel the shift in the air the moment the microsensor passed its final calibration cycle. There was a different kind of silence in the lab, an electric hush, like the world itself was holding its breath. This was what I dreamed of when I was hunched over old circuit boards in my basement, a device small enough to slip unnoticed into the cracks of a city, vigilant enough to warn of danger before a single life was lost. Preston was the first to break the quiet. He leaned over the test rig, peering through the glass window of the climate chamber as the tiny node glowed green. Zero drift, he whispered, almost to himself. Holy shit. I couldn't help but laugh, the sound sharp and unexpected. It felt like something unwound in my chest that had been tight for years. Let's not uncork the champagne yet, I said, tapping the glass with my knuckle. Field deployment's still the real test. He grinned. You never let me have my moment, do you? I let you have plenty, I shot back, and for a second we were kids again. Me in Dad's garage with my screwdrivers, him trying to steal my soldering iron to fix his bike chain. A week later, the first batch of microsensors shipped out in armored cases the size of a carry-on bag. We handed them off to a new field team Preston had been training himself. Guys who used to think a capacitor was a type of battery, now fluent in environmental thresholds and data relays. Standing on the tarmac at O'Hare, I watched the plane disappear into the clouds, each crate tagged for a different test site, a chemical plant in Manchester, an aging refinery in Houston, a cargo port in Rotterdam. Each one a place where a leak or a silent spill could erase entire blocks if no one was watching. Preston slipped his hands into his jacket pockets. You remember that Christmas you stayed up all night trying to build that homemade radio? I shot him a sideways look. The one you smashed because you were mad I wouldn't let you change the station? He winced. Yeah, that one. I remember, I said, dry as dust. He shuffled his feet on the concrete. I used to think you were stubborn for the sake of being stubborn. But you weren't. You saw what things could be. I never did. I didn't say anything. I just let him stand there, owning the words. He cleared his throat. You think these sensors are gonna work? Really work? They'll work, I said, because this time, we built them right. We stood there until the last echo of the plane's engines faded into the wind. In the weeks that followed, the real test began. Every day was a barrage of data streams, signal integrity reports, heat maps of gas flow and chemical seepage. My phone buzzed like a hornet's nest. Field crew updates, status checks, an endless parade of alerts that made my chest tighten until each one came back green. Preston became my buffer. He intercepted calls from city councils, smoothed ruffled feathers when our sensors flagged leaks people didn't want to admit existed. He sat through tense meetings with oil executives who accused us of sabotage until the data spoke for itself. The Rotterdam site was the worst. An old shipping dock, half its pipelines undocumented, rusting under decades of neglect. Our sensors flagged a slow benzene leak under a warehouse that should have been condemned years ago. I flew there myself, boots crunching over broken concrete while port officials threatened lawsuits, and local workers glared at me like I'd pointed a finger at their livelihood. Preston was at my side the whole time, clipboard in hand, calm when I wanted to scream. One night, after 12 straight hours of negotiations, we found ourselves sitting on the hood of a rented hatchback, the North Sea wind howling through the dockyard. You think they'll shut us down? He asked. No, I said. They'll try to muzzle us first, but once this hits the press, they'll have to fix it. He took a long pull from his thermos of black coffee. Funny, isn't it? When you're the one with the truth, you're the one they hate the most. That's why it's real, I said. If it wasn't, nobody would care. In the end, the Rotterdam leak made headlines. Workers were relocated, the dock was closed for repairs, and the shipping company issued a statement thanking Orion for, quote, identifying a potential risk. Privately, they threatened to sue. Publicly, they had no choice but to buy more sensors. Back in Chicago, the fallout was a storm I was ready for. The board demanded a closed-door meeting. Leonard Barrington tried to corner me with his icy brand of concern. Marisol, you're picking fights you don't need to pick, he said. You're playing with powerful people. Preston was beside me, arms folded, eyes flat as winter ice. If they're so powerful, maybe they should be better at fixing their own messes. Leonard's lip twitched. This is bad for business. No, I said. This is the business. He tried to push back, but I didn't budge. Neither did Preston. And when the dust settled, the board voted to double our rollout budget instead of cutting it. No one wanted to be the director who voted to walk away from a company that just saved a port city from a chemical disaster. Afterward, Preston and I sat in the break room, the vending machine humming like an old friend. He cracked open a soda, slid it across the table to me. So, he said, what's next? I leaned back in my chair, tracing the rim of the can with my thumb. Next, we make it so nobody has to wait for a leak to ruin their life. He raised an eyebrow. And how do you do that? We shrink it all down, I said. One sensor in every block. Every building, cheap enough to be invisible, smart enough to protect you before you even know you're in danger. He let out a low whistle. And you think people will go for that? They won't have a choice, I said. Not after this. He sat there, studying me like he was seeing the garage girl with the broken radios again. But this time, he didn't look like he pitied me. He looked like he was in awe. You know, he said, this job may not be real by your old definition, but it's the most real thing I've ever done. I lifted my soda, the cold can biting into my palm. Then let's make it count. We clinked cans in that grimy break room, the hum of our prototype singing through the walls like a promise. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was ours. The winter after Rotterdam was the hardest we'd faced yet. In Chicago, winter was always brutal. But this time the cold wasn't just outside. It was in every phone call, every city council session, every email from a supplier that wanted to double our rates because they'd seen our name in the news. Success was supposed to make it easier. That's what they never tell you. The more you win, the bigger your enemies get. Once the headlines broke that Orion's microsensors had forced one of Europe's largest shipping companies to shut down an entire port for repairs, our waiting list tripled overnight. The money rolled in, but so did the threats. At night, I'd lie awake in my cramped studio, the radiator pinging like Morse code while the wind rattled the windows. Sometimes I'd get up at 2 or 3 in the morning, make tea, and stand at the window staring out over the frozen river. I'd wonder if I was really cut out for this. Not the work I could do in my sleep, but the war of it. The lawyers, the NDAs, the smear campaigns. Preston knew. He always knew. He'd come in early, find me asleep on the lab couch, drop a fresh bagel on the table beside my laptop, and wordlessly sit down to read the latest contracts. He'd become the armor I never knew I needed. But even armor cracks. One Friday in late January, our supplier for the rare earth elements we needed for our next-gen sensors pulled out. Just like that, an entire batch of production ground to a halt. Preston spent 12 hours on the phone, calling every backup we'd ever worked with. Nothing. When he finally slumped into the chair across from my desk, he looked like he'd aged a decade in a day. "We're out of options," he said. "If we don't find another source, we can't hit the London contract's timeline." I rubbed my temples. "Then we find one." "You think they're just lying around?" His voice cracked, something I hadn't heard since we were kids. "These guys talk to each other, Marisol. We got blacklisted." "Because we told the truth," I shot back. He slammed his palm on the table, rattling my coffee mug. "And now they want to bleed us dry for it." The words hung between us. He wasn't wrong. We'd drawn blood from the wrong giants, and now they were closing ranks. I stared at the blueprints pinned to my corkboard, rows of tiny hexagonal nodes, delicate as dragonfly wings. All that promise, balanced on a supply chain I couldn't control. "What if we build our own?" I said. Preston blinked. "Our own what?" "Our own supply chain," I said. "Vertical integration. We find our own sources, build our own refining line." He barked out a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Do you have any idea what that costs?" "More than we have," I said, "but less than what they'll bleed us for over the next 10 years. He buried his face in his hands. "You're insane." "Probably," I said, "but it's the only way they can't control us." We sat there in the half-dark, the hum of the city pressing against the lab's thin windows. I knew what he was thinking, that I'd lost it, that I was about to drag us under with some half-baked idea. But I also knew Preston better than he knew himself. Give him a wall and he'd find a door. Or a sledgehammer. Sure enough, the next morning, he walked into my office with a mug of gas station coffee and a folder thick with printouts. "If we do this," he said, "we're going to need help." "Define help," I said, peering over the stack. "We buy a stake in that old recycling plant in Gary. They already process e-waste. We retrofit it to recover the rare earths." I stared at him. "That's actually smart." "Don't sound so surprised," he shot back. But there was a glimmer of pride in his eyes, too. It took 6 weeks to make the deal. 6 weeks of legal haggling, contract rewrites, and the constant gnaw of knowing every day we delayed, put our London contract closer to default. Preston lived on bad takeout and worse coffee, his hair sticking up at wild angles, a pen always jammed behind one ear. Jenna started calling us the zombies. At one point, I caught her handing Preston a bottle of vitamin gummies and threatening to smack him if he didn't eat 3 on the spot. By March, the papers were signed. Orion officially owned 51% of a crumbling brick warehouse in Gary, Indiana, our foot in the door to a supply line we could control. The first time we walked through the facility, I saw it through Preston's eyes. Cracked floors, rusted conveyors, a smell like burnt metal soaked into the walls. He looked at me like I was nuts. "This is your big plan?" he said. "It's falling apart." "So were we once," I shot back. He barked out a laugh that echoed through the hollow loading dock. "All right," he said, "let's make it ours." Over the next few months, we split our days between the lab in Chicago and the plant in Gary. Days started at dawn, ended sometime after midnight. Preston managed the retrofitting crews, sweet-talking local contractors who didn't trust our shiny city degrees. I handled the materials research, scrounging old university contacts for the tech we needed to separate rare earths from mountains of discarded batteries and circuit boards. One night, we sat side by side on a stack of shipping pallets, our breath fogging in the unheated factory. "Remember when you said my job wasn't real?" I said. He groaned. "Are you ever going to let that go?" "Nope," I said, grinning, "but I get it now, why you thought that." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh, do tell." "Because it wasn't real to you," I said. "Not until you saw what happens when people stop pretending leaks and spills and poisoned water are someone else's problem." He looked away, like he was embarrassed. "I should have seen it sooner." "Doesn't matter," I said. "You're here now." He nudged my shoulder with his. "You think this place will work?" "I think," I said, "it already is." By summer, the plant was fully operational. Small, scrappy, but ours. The first shipment of recovered elements arrived at the lab in battered steel drums, marked with our own logo. I popped one open, ran a sample under my loupe, and felt something deep in my chest loosen for the first time in years. Preston watched from the doorway, arms crossed. "Looks real to me." I just laughed, an unguarded sound that made the hum of the machines feel like a chorus. Our job wasn't just real, it was untouchable now. And it was ours. When the first shipment from our Gary plant arrived, it felt like more than metal. It felt like freedom. I remember standing there in the lab, the drums lined up like soldiers, the chemical tang of refined rare earths clinging to the air. For years, I'd built my dreams on parts someone else could withhold. Now, for the first time, no one could shut us down with a single phone call. Preston popped one drum open with a crowbar, grinning when the lid clanged onto the floor. "Smells like money," he said. "Smells like autonomy," I corrected, but I was grinning too. That first batch fed straight into the next-gen sensors we'd been prototyping. We built them faster than any spec sheet said we could, tested them in our new rooftop lab, a weatherproofed greenhouse rigged with live gas lines, humidity traps, and airflow regulators that mimicked the real world better than any sterile chamber ever could. By September, we had our first big order lined up, a contract with the City of Toronto to deploy the microsensors in aging school buildings, anywhere kids might be breathing invisible toxins from forgotten pipes and ancient wiring. I'd spent half my childhood in classrooms like that, the paint flaking off the walls, a musty chemical smell nobody talked about, so when the city inspectors came to tour our lab, I took Preston with me. He stood at my side as we walked the halls with officials in stiff suits and worried eyes. At the end of the day, we stood outside the back dock while the sun dipped behind the skyline. One of the inspectors, a wiry man with a tight smile, pulled me aside. "You're doing a good thing," he said, "but you know what this means, right?" I raised an eyebrow. "Enlighten me." "It means you're going to find things people don't want found. Schools, landlords, city managers, people who'd rather pay hush money than fix lead pipes." I just nodded. "That's why we're here." Preston overheard every word. He didn't flinch, didn't slip back into the old corporate posture, where profit outweighed people. He just slipped his hands in his pockets and watched the city lights come on. "You ready for that fight?" he asked me on the ride home. "I've been ready," I said. "The question is, are you?" He looked out the window for a long time. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Yeah, I am." When the rollout started, it was exactly the mess I knew it would be. Parents wanted answers the school board didn't have. Local contractors tried to lowball repairs. A neighborhood blog published a story accusing us of scaremongering to boost our sales. Preston handled it all. He met with neighborhood groups, sat in front of hostile city council meetings, calmly explained the data and how our sensors weren't just gadgets, they were protection. More than once, I watched him talk an entire room off a ledge with nothing but his earnestness and a single page of real numbers. But the night that proved everything to me came in late October, during a freak storm that knocked out power across half the city. I was in the lab, staring at live feeds on the big screen as the sensor network switched to backup power, relaying gas levels in schools we hadn't even officially commissioned yet. One reading spiked, carbon monoxide, somewhere near a basement boiler in an elementary school. The fail-safes we'd hard-coded into the firmware triggered an automated alert to the local fire department. 10 minutes later, the building was empty, no kids harmed, nobody dead. I turned around to find Preston leaning in the doorway, hair wet from the rain, a grin splitting his face. "Your fake job just saved 100 kids," he said. I laughed, wiped a hand across my face, and realized I was crying. "Our fake job." He stepped in, pulled me into the damp smell of his rain jacket. "Yeah, ours." The story broke the next day. For once, it wasn't a scandal or a smear piece. It was a front-page headline about the, quote, invisible guardian that caught what no one else could see. Calls flooded in. School districts from 4 states asked for proposals. Hospitals wanted quotes. Industrial sites that had once threatened to sue us now wanted to license our entire platform. Preston handled the deluge like a conductor, guiding an orchestra. He set up a dedicated comms team, trained the field staff to handle tough questions, and found the right words when parents asked, "Why wasn't this here before?" We both knew the answer, because no one wanted to see what the dark corners were hiding, but now they didn't have a choice. One night, weeks later, I sat on the lab floor with my back against the server racks. The hum of processors was a lullaby now. Preston dropped down beside me, 2 steaming cups of instant ramen in hand. "Thought you could use dinner," he said. I took the cup gratefully, burning my tongue on the first bite. "You know, when I started this, I thought I'd be happy if I built one thing that worked." He slurped his noodles, thoughtful. "You didn't just build something that worked, you built something that matters." I looked at him, my brother who once thought I was wasting my time. "So did you." He snorted. "I'm just the intern, remember?" "Not anymore," I said. "You're the guy who stood up when it counted." We sat there in the soft blue glow of the servers. 2 kids from nowhere who had turned a basement lab into a company that changed how cities breathe. Before we called it a night, he nudged my knee with his. "Hey, Marisol, you know this isn't the end, right?" I smiled. "I know." I leaned my head back against the racks, closed my eyes, and listened to the sensors ping across rooftops and classrooms and hospital corridors. Tiny signals. Proof that our work was real. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we were too. By the time winter melted into a muddy Chicago spring, Orion felt more like a city than a company. What once had been a cluttered workshop under flickering fluorescent lights was now 3 entire floors of converted warehouse space, labs, microfab lines, open workstations that hummed with the quiet chatter of engineers, coders, field ops, and the constant ping of live sensor feeds blinking green on wall-sized dashboards. If I was honest, sometimes it scared me how big it had all gotten. Some mornings, I'd stand in the elevator mirror and barely recognize the woman staring back. Gone were the grease-stained jeans and lab goggles perched on my head. Now it was blazer, boots, and a badge that read CEO, my name, my company, my rules. But the work? The work was still the same. It was in the solder fumes of our prototype wing, the nervous laughter of the interns pulling double shifts to get the next firmware patch just right. It was the tremor in Preston's voice when he called me at 2 a.m. to say he'd caught a sensor drift before it hit the field. It was Jenna leaning into my office doorway with that half grin, dropping off the latest incident report with a sticky note that just read, "Fixed it." Preston had grown into his title like it was stitched to his skin. The former, quote, intern now had a badge that read Director of Field Operations. But the difference was more than a nameplate. He'd become the person people called when things fell apart in the middle of the night. The one who could look a city engineer dead in the eye and say, "We're not just here for the install, we're here for every breath after." The Toronto pilot became the blueprint for everything that followed. New Orleans signed on next, a city still licking its wounds from storms and broken levees. They wanted sensors in hospitals, levee pumps, old chemical plants lurking near the bayous. Preston took the lead on the contract, hammering out the language until it read like a promise. "You think you're ready for hurricane season?" I asked him one night as we watched the last draft roll off the printer. He gave me a look. "No one's ever ready, but we'll be there." I believed him. For once, that was enough. Then came the whistleblower. It was a Tuesday morning when the email landed in my inbox. No subject line, no signature. Just a scanned letter and a grainy photo of corroded pipes buried under a school gym in Mississippi. The note was simple. "Your sensors picked it up. They're ignoring you. Kids are getting sick." I felt a knot in my stomach unwind and retie itself. This was why we existed. But it was also the fight no one ever wanted to have. I called Preston into my office. He read the letter twice, then let out a low whistle. "You think it's legit?" he asked. "I think," I said. "We can't afford to assume it isn't." He rubbed his jaw, eyes darting to the news feed on the big monitor behind me. "You know they'll come after us. Hard." "Let them," I said. "We didn't build this place to look away." Within 12 hours, we were on a flight south. Jenna took the lead at the plant, while Preston and I rented a battered white pickup and drove 3 hours past the last city lights. The school sat at the end of a cracked road, chain-link fences rusted to lace. You could smell the damp rot before you even stepped out of the truck. Inside, our field sensor nodes were still blinking. Green, then yellow, then red. I watched Preston crouch beside an old utility panel, his flashlight beam dancing over pipes that looked like they'd been weeping for decades. "Jesus," he muttered. "How are they even running this building?" I didn't have an answer. Neither did the superintendent when we cornered him in his office. His face gone pale when we laid out the data. Lead levels triple the safe limit. CO seeping in through cracked vents. Half the HVAC system sealed with duct tape and prayers. "If you go public with this," he hissed, "you'll ruin us." "No," I said, "the truth did that. We're just showing people what you covered up." That night, the story broke. Preston sat on the motel bed, his phone buzzing nonstop as local news anchors ran shaky footage of our team pulling test samples. His eyes flicked up to meet mine across the tiny room. "This is gonna burn," he said. "So let it burn," I said. "It's how you make room for something better." The fallout was exactly as brutal as he'd predicted. Lawsuits, denials, angry parents showing up at City Hall. But for every door that slammed shut, 2 more cracked open. Other districts reached out, quietly at first, then louder, asking for help. They wanted the sensors. They wanted us. Weeks later, back at the lab, Preston found me staring at our main dashboard, watching the red blips turn green one by one as repairs started. He dropped a coffee on my desk. "You ever wish we'd taken the easy path?" he asked. "No," I said. "Do you?" He shook his head. "Never." He hesitated, then leaned against my desk. "You know what the old me would have done? I'd have told you to bury it, spin the data, protect the contract." "And now?" He laughed, soft and tired. "Now I want the next town, and the one after that." I smiled. "Good, because they're already calling." And when he left my office that night, I sat in the glow of the screens. Green lights blinking across neighborhoods, schools, water plants, the lifelines of people who would never know our names. That was fine by me. We'd know. And that was enough. I pulled up the first prototype design I'd sketched years ago, scratched on the back of a grocery receipt, still pinned to my digital files like a relic. Next to it, I opened the live feed from the Mississippi site, sensors tucked into places no one could see, but everyone could trust. Preston was right. It wasn't the end. Not even close. Our job wasn't real once. Now it was as real as every life it touched. And we were just getting started. The fallout from Mississippi didn't just change our company, it changed us. The lab didn't feel like a startup anymore. It felt like a frontline. Every day, the phones rang with people we'd never met. School nurses, parents, janitors, city workers. Ordinary people telling us about the pipes that rattled when they shouldn't. The headaches no one could explain. The faint metallic taste in the tap water. They sent photos. They sent tears. And they asked the same question, can you help us? We always said yes. But saying yes wasn't easy. With every city that came knocking, the target on our backs grew. Some towns welcomed us in with open arms, seeing the sensors as a lifeline. Others locked us out, afraid of what the blinking lights might expose. The ones who'd gotten rich off the status quo, the corrupt inspectors, the cheap landlords, the backroom deal makers, suddenly found us in their way. They didn't like it. Sometimes they came for me directly. Anonymous letters, legal threats that made Jenna's head spin, articles in trade rags calling me a fearmonger, a panic peddler. For every piece that praised our work, another twisted it into an attack on good, hard-working businesses, just trying to survive. I'd be lying if I said it didn't get to me. I'd come home after another 12-hour day, collapse into the dented couch in my shoebox apartment, and let my brain swirl with every what if? What if we lost the next contract? What if we couldn't afford the lawyers this time? What if the people we were fighting for turned on us when it got too real? Preston saw it. He'd find me in the break room, staring at a mug of cold coffee I'd forgotten to drink. He never said, "Don't worry." He knew better. Instead, he'd slide a folder across the table. Field reports, fresh site data, updates from the plant in Gary. Proof that we were still winning the quiet battles that didn't make headlines. "It's working," he'd say. "Don't let them make you forget that." And every time, it helped. One cold morning in March, Preston and I stood in front of the biggest city contract we'd ever chased, Philadelphia. The city wanted a full-scale deployment, schools, factories, low-income housing units built before LEED laws even existed. It was the contract that could fund our next leap, a national grid that could sniff out the invisible threats in every corner of the country. But they needed proof. They wanted a live demo. No room for error, Preston said as we set up the test site, an abandoned community center, cracked windows, rust bleeding from ancient pipes. If the signal drops for even a second, they'll walk. So we don't let it drop, I said. Simple. Impossible. But we'd done impossible before. The night before the demo, the team camped out in the parking lot. Jenna set up folding tables, laptops, coils of spare fiber cables. The air smelled like burnt coffee and stale fast food wrappers. Preston didn't sit down once. He paced the perimeter like a guard dog, barking instructions, double-checking every line of code that ran from the sensors back to our cloud servers. At 3 a.m, he found me dozing on a metal folding chair, a thermal blanket wrapped around my shoulders. "Get some sleep," he said. "You're gonna scare them tomorrow if you look like a zombie." "Look who's talking," I shot back, eyeing the bags under his eyes. He shrugged, a crooked grin breaking through. "One of us has to stay pretty for the investors." I flicked the back of his hand, but I didn't argue. He was right. The old Preston would have snuck out the back the moment things got hard. This Preston, my Preston, would sooner sleep on asphalt than let us down. When the city's inspectors arrived the next morning, we were ready. They brought the press, too. Cameras rolling, microphones thrust under my chin as I rattled off specs and failsafes. I watched Preston hover just behind the reporters, arms folded, his eyes locked on the sensor feed scrolling across a laptop screen. When the readings held steady, no drift, no dropouts, I caught his eye. He didn't smile, didn't cheer, he just nodded once. We'd done it. The city signed the contract that afternoon. The ink was still drying when our phones exploded. Other cities calling, wanting the same thing. We didn't have to chase the work anymore. It was chasing us. That night, we found ourselves back on the lab roof. Same dented folding chairs, same skyline, same feeling that the real victory was just out of reach but closer than ever before. "How big do you think this gets?" Preston asked, his breath clouding in the cold. "Big," I said. "Bigger than us." He laughed. "You used to hate big." "I still do," I said. "But if we build it right, big doesn't have to mean empty." He leaned back, arms crossed behind his head. "Think we'll ever be done?" I didn't answer right away. I listened to the faint buzz of the city below. Generators, car engines, the constant flow of life that didn't know it was being protected by a handful of blinking dots hidden in basements and crawl spaces. "No," I said, "we'll never be done." He nudged my boot with his. "Good." And there it was again, that tiny thing I never let myself hope for. Trust, not just in the tech. In him. In the morning, we dragged ourselves down to the break room for terrible coffee. The first email in my inbox was a reminder of what came next. The next city, the next fight, the next secret we'd drag into the light whether people liked it or not. I called a team meeting. The lab was packed shoulder to shoulder. New faces, old friends, people I'd once taught to solder their first circuit, now leading their own teams. "This doesn't get easier," I told them. "It gets bigger. The pushback gets louder. But every sensor we install, every leak we catch before it destroys someone's home, every kid who breathes clean air because of what you built, that's real." I saw Preston at the back, leaning against the door, arms folded and smiling just enough that it steadied my voice. "They can say what they want," I said. "But this is the job, and no one can tell us it isn't real." They cheered. Not the polite applause of a corporate boardroom, but the rough, raw sound of people who knew they were part of something they could carry into the dark corners of the world. Later, as the team drifted back to work, Preston stayed behind. He walked up, hooked an arm around my shoulders like he used to when we were kids. "You did it," he said. "You made them see it." "We did it," I corrected, "and we're not done." He squeezed my shoulder once, then stepped back. "Good, because the next city's already on line 1. We laughed. We always did, and then we got back to work. Spring in Chicago never lasted long. The cold always found its way back in, creeping through window seals and drafty hallways, no matter how many radiators you fed with steam. But in the Orion lab, the air was different now, warmer, charged with the hum of something we'd fought tooth and nail to build. It had been 6 months since Philadelphia, 6 months of new cities, new contracts, new ways to be told that our work was inconvenient for people who'd gotten rich ignoring the truth. Every success painted a bigger target on our backs, and every target felt like a sign we were doing it right. Preston thrived in that storm. He'd come in at dawn, hair still wet from the shower, cell phone jammed between his shoulder and chin, while he juggled supplier calls with his free hand. The quote-quote Plemsmocht was now the one field teams called first when they were up against a wall, the one who stayed until the last solder joint cooled and the last line of code went live. One Friday evening, we stood at the far end of the main lab, leaning against a stack of shipping crates filled with the next wave of microsensors. Preston cracked open 2 bottles of lukewarm soda, handed me one, and tipped his bottle toward the crates. "Think this is what Dad would have wanted?" he asked. I looked at him, the way he was now, tired, sure, but standing taller than he ever had when he wore his old corporate suits. "I think Dad would have been proud we didn't wait around for someone else to fix things." He chuckled. "He always did say you were too stubborn for your own good." "Takes one to know one," I shot back. We drank our sodas, the hiss of pressurized air from the HVAC system the only sound between us. The next morning, we rolled out the biggest test yet, a full-city pilot in Baltimore. Hundreds of sensors went live at once, blanketing aging row houses and crumbling schools, creaking chemical plants that leaked stories no one wanted to hear. For 48 hours, we sat in the command center, a glass-walled room at the heart of the lab, eyes glued to the dashboard. No dropouts, no ghost signals. Just clean, precise data flowing in, Every red spike meant a danger caught. Every green light meant another family slept safe. Jenna burst into the room at dawn, 2 mugs of stale coffee balanced in one hand. "The city wants a presser," she said. "They want you both up there." I raised an eyebrow. "Both?" "Yeah," she said, flicking her gaze to Preston. "They know who built this thing." Preston looked at me like he couldn't believe it. The man who once laughed at my fake job now asked if I'd stand beside him on a stage and call it what it was: real. We did the press conference in a community center that smelled like damp linoleum and old paint. The podium wobbled when I leaned on it, but the mics were steady. The crowd was bigger than I expected. City officials, residents, reporters with too many questions and not enough time. Preston stepped up first. He told them how the sensors worked, what they'd already found in the first 2 days. He answered every question with the kind of clarity that comes from getting your hands dirty. The man who once only knew PowerPoints now spoke in solder points and firmware. When it was my turn, I looked out at the sea of tired eyes and anxious frowns. "I know some people wish we'd go away," I said. "They think ignorance is cheaper than the truth. They think they can call this a scare tactic or a marketing stunt. But this," I pointed to the monitor behind us, all those blinking dots, "this is real. This is the job." They clapped. Some people even stood. Not everyone, but enough. That night, after the crowds cleared and the lights shut down, Preston and I sat on the front steps of the community center, the Baltimore skyline jagged and beautiful against the night sky. "You ever think about the first time you called my job fake?" I asked, nudging him with my shoulder. He winced. "Don't you ever get tired of reminding me?" "Nope," I said, grinning. He leaned back on his elbows. "I'm glad you didn't give up on me." "I didn't give up on us," I said. "Big difference." We sat in the hush, the hum of the city carrying our promise forward. The next week brought another wave. Hospitals in Detroit, factories in Cleveland, an entire block of crumbling public housing in St. Louis, where the kids had been breathing poison for years. One by one, the calls came. One by one, we said yes. Every new project was a war of phone calls, permits, and contractors who didn't always care. But it was also nights in the break room with Jenna. Nights when Preston would drop his head on the table and mutter, "How the hell did you do this alone for so long?" "Didn't," I'd say, tapping him on the forehead with my pencil. "I had you, whether you liked it or not." And we'd laugh, and then we'd work. Sometimes I'd catch him late at night, leaning over a test rig, lips moving as he checked voltages like a mantra. The same man who once mocked my tiny solder joints now traced them with careful fingers, triple-checking every contact. One night, as dawn edged through the windows, he found me at my desk, eyes red from sleep I hadn't taken. "Go home," he said. "Sleep." "You first," I shot back. He sat on the corner of my desk, staring at the city lights blinking through the blinds. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think if something didn't have a title, $1 million invoice, a plaque on a fancy office door, it wasn't real. And now?" He glanced at the screens, our sensors humming in basements and attics, in factories and schools, in places no one wanted to look until they couldn't look away. "Now," he said, "it's the only thing that is." I reached over, squeezed his wrist. "Good, then let's keep it that way." In the months that followed, we kept building. Faster, better, smarter. And every time a new threat was caught, every time a kid walked out of a school that might have poisoned them, every time a family opened their taps and tasted only water, I heard Preston's voice in my head. Real. It was more than the job. It was our promise. And we were just getting started. By the time the Baltimore contract was in full swing, it felt like we were living inside a network of our own making, a living, breathing lattice of tiny nodes, each one a promise that someone, somewhere, wouldn't be left in the dark again. But if there was one thing Preston and I had learned by then, it was this: every promise came with a cost. The bigger we got, the more invisible our enemies became. I saw it in the fine print of supplier agreements suddenly rewritten to double our costs. I heard it in the backroom whispers at city council meetings, how some officials said we were too aggressive, too disruptive, too much trouble. What they meant was, we were too honest, We wouldn't sign the NDAs that kept leaks off the front page. We wouldn't fake a censor reading to save a city's budget. And we sure as hell wouldn't stop when someone told us, "It's not your business." It was exactly our business. And Preston, God bless him, had turned that defiance into an art. It started with the Cleveland site, a cluster of factories that had leaked so many volatile chemicals over decades that you could practically smell them in the snowmelt. Our sensors flagged it immediately: benzene spikes, methane pockets, radon seeping through cracked floors. The data didn't lie, the plant managers did. The local paper called it a public relations nightmare for the city. The plant threatened to sue us for defamation. And through it all, Preston was the first one on the phone, the first one in the meeting room, the first one to stand up and say, "Go ahead, sue us. The data is the data." One night, after another tense city meeting where the factory's lawyers had tried to bury us in legal threats, I found Preston pacing our rooftop, breath misting in the cold. "They're bluffing," he said, more to himself than to me. "Maybe," I said, "but they'll drag it out as long as they can, make us look like troublemakers." "We are troublemakers," he shot back, a grin cracking through his frustration. "The right kind." I leaned on the metal railing, looking out at the rows of flickering lights marking our sensors across the city. "You remember when you told me I should get a real job?" "You're never gonna let that go, are you?" he groaned. "Not a chance," I said, laughing. "You see it now, though, right?" He sobered, leaning next to me, our shoulders brushing. "Yeah, I see it." And in that moment, I did too. The kid who once mocked what he didn't understand now stood shoulder to shoulder with me in the storm. He'd become the guy who answered the phone at midnight when a sensor spiked red. The one who'd stand in a hearing and explain, calm, precise, how a $50 piece of silicon could stop a neighborhood from dying one lung at a time. When Cleveland didn't shut us down, more cities called. They didn't care if we were troublemakers, they cared that we were right. Detroit, Cincinnati, Newark. Each rollout felt like we were pulling back a layer of paint to reveal the rot underneath. And every time, we got the same calls, the same threats. "Shut up, go away, stop making noise." And every time, Preston would shoot me that look, across the conference room table, the one that said, "Let them try." But it wasn't just the enemies that kept me up at night, it was the weight. The weight of promises we made. The weight of every family who trusted that the blinking dot on their block meant someone was paying attention. Some nights, I'd sit in my office long after the lab had gone quiet, staring at the live feed. Green dots where we'd fixed things. Red ones waiting for us to get there before it was too late. Preston always knew where to find me. He'd walk in, drop a paper bag of greasy takeout on my desk, and sit without saying anything. He didn't need to. Just knowing he was there made it bearable. One night, I caught him staring at the big screen, his eyes tracing the newest city we'd gone live in, Milwaukee. He looked older now, the lines around his eyes deeper, but there was a steadiness there I'd never seen when he was the golden boy of someone else's company. "Do you ever miss it?" I asked. "The easy money?" He laughed, short and sharp. "No, you know what I miss? Sleep." "Same," I said. "But I'll take this over sleep any day." And we did. We took every sleepless night, every fight, every piece of hate mail, and every lawsuit threat. Because the flip side was this: a school that didn't evacuate after an invisible leak, a family that didn't wake up coughing, a kid who could drink from the tap without poison lacing the taste. We were so close to something bigger, something we could hand to the next city, the next generation, like a blueprint for what real should mean. Then came the merger offer. It landed in my inbox like a bomb, a giant multinational, one of the same old empires we'd been fighting, offering to partner. But the fine print said what it always did. They'd buy us out, fold our sensors into their catalog, slap a new logo on the boxes, and let the invisible threats slip back into the dark. Preston read the email over my shoulder. He didn't say a word for a long time. Finally, he let out a low whistle. "They're scared." "They should be," I said. "So?" he asked. "What do you want to do?" I looked at him, my brother, my partner, the man who once thought I was wasting my time. He didn't flinch. He didn't hedge. He just waited for me to answer. "We tell them no," I said, "and then we build bigger." He grinned. "Good. I was hoping you'd say that." We drafted the rejection ourselves. No lawyers, no middlemen, just one clear line. Our work is not for sale. The fallout was exactly what you'd expect. Angry calls, veiled threats. But our people? They rallied. They stayed late. They worked through weekends. They knew exactly what that no meant. We were fighting for every block, every street, every person who needed someone to look the other way, and refused. One night, long after everyone had gone home, Preston and I stood on the loading dock, watching a new batch of sensors roll onto trucks bound for a city we hadn't even visited yet. The sky above us was the same bruised purple it had been the night I first told him what I was building in my basement. Only now, we were standing in a place we'd built together. "You know," he said, nudging me with his elbow, "it's still not too late to sell out and run off to an island." "Nah," I said, laughing. "This is better." "You think we'll ever be done?" I looked out at the trucks, at the maps, at the endless web of lives stitched together by blinking lights and raw, stubborn hope. "No," I said, "but I don't want to be." He reached for my hand, squeezed it once. "Good." And in that moment, the cold didn't matter. The enemies didn't matter. All that mattered was this. We had built something real, something no one could take away. And we weren't done yet. We used to measure our success in the hum of soldering irons and the smell of burnt flux drifting through the lab's open windows. Now it was in the glow of the map on the big wall, the living constellation of every sensor we'd ever placed, blinking steady in homes and schools and factories we'd never step foot inside. It was a cold dawn when Preston and I stood in the new command center, a glass-walled floor at the top of our renovated warehouse, the hum of the city below replaced by the hush of hundreds of lives connected by what we'd built. We didn't say much, we didn't have to. The map said it all. After we turned down the merger, the world had tried harder than ever to push us back into our corner. One investor bailed, claiming we'd lost our sense of scale. A city official in Kansas called us radical activists masquerading as engineers. A cable news host called us the leak hunters, and not as a compliment. But the people? They knew better. They came to the lab in battered cars and late-night buses. Contractors who'd once sneered at our specs now asked to be trained on the new installations. Parents who used to drop off their kids at schools blind to the poison in the pipes now stood shoulder to shoulder with us at council meetings, demanding more sensors, more truth. Every night, Preston closed out the dashboard before we turned off the lights. He'd hover at my side, his eyes tracing the little pulses of green and yellow, a rhythm only he and I could hear. Once, I caught him tapping a knuckle against the screen where a cluster of lights blinked over Cleveland. "Remember when you used to think this didn't count?" I asked him. He grinned, that sheepish twist in his smile that still made him look 12. Yeah, keep reminding me." "You deserve it," I teased. But the truth was, he did. The Preston who once called my job fake now caught the cracks in our supply chain before they formed. He was the first to stand up in City Hall when someone tried to cut our funding. The guy who once thought my basement lab was a hobby now turned down million-dollar bribes because he finally understood what I'd been building all along. Our Gary plant had grown too. What started as a rusting skeleton of a recycling line now hummed day and night. The whine of centrifuges reclaiming rare earths from discarded batteries and rusted boards. We'd made ourselves untouchable because we'd made ourselves unnecessary to the middlemen who once held us hostage. One rainy afternoon, Preston and I visited the plant unannounced. We stood on the catwalk overlooking rows of drums stacked neatly beside the lines, workers in safety goggles hauling scrap that would be reborn as the guts of our next sensors. "Never thought I'd see this," he said, his voice almost lost in the din, "a supply chain that can't be bought out from under us." "That was the point," I said. "If they can't cut us off, they can't control us." He drummed his fingers on the railing, then shot me a sidelong look. "Think they know that yet?" "They're starting to," I said, "but that's not our problem." We left before the next shift rolled in, rain streaking down the windows of the rental as we headed back to Chicago. Neither of us spoke. We didn't have to. The truth sat between us like an engine humming at idle. We'd done it our way, and they hadn't stopped us yet. At the lab, the team waited for us. Jenna leaning on her laptop, grinning like a cat with a secret. "You two see the new numbers yet?" she asked, tilting her screen so we could see the spike in green nodes on the East Coast. "Boston signed," she said. "They want the full rollout by winter." Preston barked out a laugh that startled half the engineers across the floor. "Boston? They wouldn't even return our calls last year." "Funny what happens when they realize the leaks don't just fix themselves," I said. We celebrated that night the only way we knew how. Bad pizza, flat soda, the hum of the servers in the background like a lullaby. Preston clinked his plastic cup against mine. "To real jobs," he said. "To the people who make them real," I corrected. He grinned. "You know, I've been meaning to ask you something." "Shoot." "What's next? After Boston, I mean." I leaned back in my chair, the ceiling lights casting lazy halos above our heads. "Next? We push this out so far they can't pull it back. Make it cheap enough that no city can say they can't afford it." "Think they'll let us?" he asked. "They won't have a choice," I said. He raised his cup again. Good. It wasn't the end, not by a long shot. We still had cities that slammed doors in our faces, lawyers who swore they'd bury us in injunctions. But every green dot on the map was one more promise that couldn't be revoked. Late that night, when the lab had gone quiet, Preston found me standing in the break room, staring at our mission statement tacked up on the corkboard, still scrawled in my handwriting from the basement days. "Make the invisible visible. Make it real." He draped an arm over my shoulders. "You did it, you know." "We did," I said. "So," he asked, "when do you think you'll stop reminding me about the real job thing?" I looked up at him, the brother I'd lost and found a dozen times over. "Never!" He barked out a tired laugh. "Fair." When we left that night, the city lay before us, a mess of lights and shadows stitched together by our stubborn hope. Trucks rolled out of the dock below, sensors stacked in crates headed for people who'd never know our names but would breathe a little easier because of what we'd built. Before we shut the door, I looked back at the map on the wall, those blinking lights stretching farther than I'd ever dared dream. One more city, one more promise, one more reason to keep going. We weren't done. We'd never be done. Because this job, it wasn't just real. It was everything. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.